that 25 years. And here's a biggie, again, there was no tribal consent required. This allotment act, they didn't come out here to meet with the tribe and say, we have this idea, we have this scheme, do you agree to go along with it and cut up your tribal lands? There was no consent required. It was a forced policy. Allotment was forced on tribes. Okay. So how did it work? And it worked a little different on different reservations. Some have very specific allotment acts that change these acreages. But generally, the head of the family would receive 160 acres. A single person would receive 80 acres if they were male. And everybody under 18 years of age, they would receive 40 acres. In many places, the eligible Indians, and that's the term, eligible, they had the right to try to select where their lands were, but if they didn't, the secretary would do it for them. And then after all the land was allotted to the Indians, then they sold off some of your reservation land or they opened it up for homesteading. So some of these really prime lands that you have in cultivation, I'm sure that they were the first that were coveted because they were, profitable. This eligible Indian, to be eligible for the allotment, that Indian agent had to decide who was an Indian. They had to decide, well, who are all these people living here? Who's an Indian? And that's where enrollment comes from. That's where your base rolls come from. So they had to first figure out that you were an Indian and list you and then give you an allotment. And there's a lot of talk about that. There's a lot of places where allotment was fraudulent. You had people that were never really even part of that tribe. They were non-Indian and they got an allotment. But that's where your whole enrollment comes from. And we had lots of questions about that yesterday. Where does the quarter blood come from? There's nothing in the law that said you had to be, nothing in this allotment act or anything that talked about any kind of blood quantum. But the Indian agents had the latitude to try to figure out who they thought was Indian and to do a base roll and then to allot the land. The other thing they did is some of the Indian agent reports that we've read, they would put a notice out and tell everybody to come to the agency because they're going to allot land. And it's known that back in those times, because we had gone through smallpox and we had gone through starvation and just the cultural lifestyle, many men had more than one wife. And that was part of the whole, basically enhancing our population. But when they came to the Indian agent to have the allotment, whoever they came with, they'd marry them. They actually married them to create your modern nuclear family with their kids, and then that's how they did the allotment. So that's actually how these allotments worked, that you had these units. A family unit, the more kids you had, the more land you were going to get at the time. And that's the scheme of the allotment. And then in 1891, there was an act that was passed that for everybody who was allotted, if you were allotted grazing land, then this act was authorized to double the land that you got. So if your whole unit, your family, got all grazing land, they would increase it. They would double how much you got if it was grazing land in 1891. They also, one other thing that we didn't hit on is this allotment. It was also to try to make you sort of separate from your tribalism, the tribal ways that you had, where you all moved camp together. Nomadic Indians all lived together and kind of had large groups. It wanted to end that. It wanted you to live separately by yourself, take care of your own family, and not be all connected to your tribe.
when they were developing the Dawes Act and they were looking at what was happening on reservations and seeing Indians starving, a lot of those senators were like, well, what is the problem here? Why do we think this is going on? And their perception, again, when we talk about that this cultural racism is embedded in the foundation of the way that the United States deals with tribal people, is they essentially, like one of the discussions they had is, they're too connected to still being Indian. They're still connected to their tribes. If we can find a way to turn them into thinking more about themselves as individuals, then they'll figure out how to farm and they won't be starving. That their connection to the tribe is part of the problem. So allotments were meant to, it was an express desire to turn you into thinking about yourself as an individual and to think about land ownership as individual ownership.
Which was real foreign to the way you were. The way we all were as Plains Indians. We never marked off parcels of land and say, don't you come over here, don't you cross this. This is my land, don't you touch it. We weren't like that. That is not part of the tribal culture. But after allotment, we have embraced that. We have embraced that. That did change us. It did change the way that we think about the land. We no longer had that communal ownership for the good of the whole. It was now individual. And so that was very successful in making that cultural change. Okay. Also in 1891, not here, but there are certain places where an Indian could basically separate themselves from the tribe and they could get an allotment in the public domain. So in other words, they could homestead lands if they would agree to break away from the tribe. And there are lots of public domain allotments in Montana. We don't have many in the Dakotas, but we do. There are some all over the country in different places. There's also a lot of public domain allotments out in the state of Washington. Those are where the Indians just basically left the tribe and said, okay, I'll live like a white person, not an Anglo person, and off the reservation and get a homestead in the public domain. So that was offered in 1891. And then also, prior to this, there was no law to figure out what to do when that allottee died. When the allottee died, who got the land? You would think, well, naturally, their children. But there was no law that said that. So the Indian agent would decide who would get the land, and they had complete authority to do that. So sometimes when a allottee died, it's likely they would say, well, you know what, this allottee died. Let me give you all of that land they had over here to somebody else completely different. There wasn't that right of inheritance by the heirs. That didn't happen until 1891 when the state law would be applied. State law, they would use the state where the land was to actually determine who the heirs were and how inheritance would work. Yes?
The 1889 Act also says that, the one that split up the reservation, it says that the state inheritance laws apply.
Right, in 1890.
1889 is the one that enforced the Dawes Act, the 1887 Act, on the Pocos.
Okay, so that preceded this by a couple years. Yeah, and there are acts of Congress that are very specific to reservations. Some reservations have 4 or 5 allotment acts. So this is the general scheme that we wanted to give you, and we do think that it's fairly applicable in the acreages that were first provided. Yeah.
They excluded Oklahoma and New York tribes because if they knew if they gave them all 160 acres, they'd have to make the reservations bigger, and they wouldn't get any surplus land, so they excluded them.
Yeah, and so there are acts, and then you do know there are tribes that are take Salt River, Pima Maricopa, take some of those reservations where there wasn't much land, so those allotments, of course, were very small, but very valuable in some places, like Salt River, and also who's at Palm Springs, Agua Caliente, they're allotted, and so they have very small allotments. So they were very, it was careful, strategic on how they did it everywhere. Okay. All right, so then they put you on this land. They say you had a family and you got a big acreage and they put you on the land and they said, okay, go at it here. You've got this agricultural land, support yourself, farm or ranch, some kind of agricultural production. What didn't they give you? What didn't they give you? What didn't they think about for you to do that? What didn't they provide to you when they told you to go farm and ranch? Huh? Training, what else? Huh? Equipment? Yep, give some stuff away. So they didn't give you any money. They didn't tell you how to be a farmer. We weren't farmers. Did they tell you how to, farm and grow crops? Did they give you any money to buy cattle? No. Did they give you a loan? No, because what? You didn't have any collateral for a loan. Because who owned your land? Who had the title to that land? If you went to the bank and you tried to get a loan, who had title to your land? The United States. So you couldn't get a loan like another white farmer over here in Bennett County. He could go and he could take his title to his land and get an operating loan to grow crops, buy equipment, do all of that. So they gave you that land, but they didn't give you any ability to actually become a successful farmer, because no farmer has the money to go and buy equipment and to buy seed and to have help and to get that done. So that's what happened. And so our people, again, this didn't help. The Allotment Act didn't help. Yeah, you had land, but it didn't help you become self-sustaining. There were a few places, and you probably have examples here, but there are some people that did make a go of it. Some people did get into farming and ranching. That's true. But for the majority of the population that was allotted, it did not, it wasn't successful, farming and ranching operations. So Indians were wanting to sell their land. And of course, they were suffering, they were starving, there was not another way to make money, so it was difficult. So what happened is, the United States is watching all that, and in 1906, they passed the Burke Act. What the Burke Act did in 1906 is it let the Indian allottee go and get a fee patent for their land. Prior to that 25-year trust period, before the 25 years was over with, you could go and you could request a fee patent on your land if you were competent. They would say, if you were a competent Indian and you requested a fee patent, that you could get it. And when you got a fee patent, you could do two things. If you got the fee patent, you could then get a mortgage on your land with that fee patent because you own the title, and you could try to farm, but more often than not, a lot of people sold their land right after they got the fee patent. So that happened in 1906. Competency wasn't like mental competency. That's not what competency was. Competency was whether or not you could speak English, whether or not maybe you could read, whether you dressed. For the men, they had some standards that said if they wore boots and not moccasins, if they wore a hat, if they dressed like, a non-Indian, then you were considered competent. Also, then during this period of time, there were competency commissions that were formed. The competency commissions were a group of sometimes federal people, but they also would hire Indians right from your own tribe. And they would go out and they would look at all the allottees and they would see who they thought was a competent Indian. And maybe you're making a go of your farming operation. Maybe you're reading and writing and you're living like a non-Indian. They would force a fee patent on you. they forced a lot of fee patents on people under the Competency Commission, which ended in 1914. So this was a big way that they started to infringe and take away land right here through this Burke Act process. All right, so what happened here? This is just a chart that shows you how much land was lost as we moved along through these proceedings. Let me see, before we get here, let me talk a little bit about that Competency Commission. Also, if you as an Indian were interested in the presidential election or an election and you wanted to vote, if you went in before 1926 to vote, when you were not a citizen yet, but if you wanted to vote, you could vote and you could be made a citizen, but they would give you a fee patent on your land. So that was a whole nother way that a lot of land was lost when people wanted to participate in national elections. And then there was another, and we talked about yesterday, is that there were some merchants that set up on these reservations, some trading posts and merchants, and they would give Indians credit to get seed or to get, equipment for their farming operations. And when they couldn't pay their debt to that merchant or mercantile, then a lot of times those owners of those businesses went to the Indian agent and said, this guy's got a great big debt and he can't pay his debt to me, and I will buy his land to cover his debt if you give him a fee patent. And we have several reservations that there's a very well-documented history of that. There were people yesterday that thought that there was some of that activity here. The most flagrant one we know about is called the Sherborne Mercantile at Blackfeet, where that Sherborne was a merchant totally in cahoots with the Indian agent, lots of forced fee patents, and Indians lost land to cover their debts at the mercantile for all the supplies and food and other things that they needed. So lots of really underhanded, difficult events that were occurring that took land out of trust ownership. So here's where we ended up. First of all, there were only 219 reservations that underwent allotment. So not all of Indian country was allotted, only 219. And that's between 1887 and 1934. Allotment ended in 1934. So during those years, 219 reservations were allotted. Then from 1887 to 1900, 53,168 individual allotments were granted. So they gave out 5 million acres of these reservation lands to Indians, to individual Indians. And that was 53,000 different allotments were granted. So then, by the time 1920 came along, 36 million acres of all of these reservation lands were allotted to individuals. All right, then we hit 1934. Look what happened when we hit 1934. 138 million acres of tribal trust land was reduced all the way down to only 48 million acres. We lost 90 million acres from people that had land allotted to them, a fee patent issued, and it was either sold or taken by taxes. Because remember, when you have a fee patent issued to you, even if it's forced on you, you have to pay taxes. You can't pay taxes, and then land is lost. So land was lost, and then we still had at 1934 about 11 million acres in individual ownership. So the individual Indians only held across all of these reservations 11 million acres and only 37 million acres in tribal ownership. Those numbers are fairly stagnant. We're not much off from that now. The 11 million acres in individual ownership has probably diminished, and the tribal has moved up some because of buyback. Buyback affected those numbers some. So that's where we ended up. Where are we at with time? Okay, let's take a break. Why don't you guys move around? There's more snacks or coffee. We'll take a little short break and then get back to this.
10 minutes?
10 minutes. All right.
Recording stopped.